Hey folks, it's me again, Christian, and today I'm bringing you API. So, let's talk about what is an API, what is the purpose of an API, how to create an API using Node.js and Express, and we are going to talk about several other topics that involves or they are involved when we are talking about API, which is HTTP verbs, what is the HTTP protocol, middleware, and we also going to talk about HTTP status codes because everything is related these days. In 2023, all these terms are connected, are related when we are talking about creating an API or we're talking about APIs in general. So let's dive in, first of all, with the information. So the term API stands for Application Programming Interface, and it's a way for two or more computers or programs to communicate with each other. It's a type of software interface offering a service to other pieces of software. In contrast to a user interface, which connects a computer to a person, an application programming interface, or API, connects computers or pieces of software to each other. So this is interesting about APIs. The term API was first used more or less in the 1940s, 40s and 50s. So API is not a new term, although obviously at that time people were not talking about APIs like we do today. It was not up until the year 1990 that API became more or less the API that we know today. And then finally we come to the year 2000. Roy Fielding's dissertation about architecture styles and the design of network-based software architecture at UC Irvine in 2000 outlined representation state transfer, or REST, as described the idea of a network-based application programming interface that Fielding contrasted with traditional library-based APIs. XML and JSON web APIs saw widespread commercial adoption beginning in 2000 and continue as of today. The web API is now the most common meaning of the term API. So you see how the API progressed over the years to become what we know as an API today, which is a programmable interface that we can communicate with using web protocols, meaning using HTTP protocol. One example of a good API would be the API for cryptocurrency, for example. You have the cryptocurrency APIs all over the world that you can simply request the cryptocurrency that you want to check the values for, and you get back those values. You don't want to know what is going on behind the scenes. You don't want to know how often the system keeps track of the values going up or down. You just want to make a request and get the values. That's one example. Another example would be about information about flights. You can today go into a flight API and get all the information that you need about a flight, or any flight that you want, or all the flights if you want, to present on your own user interface the way you want it, but you don't want to know how that information has been created, right? That's the purpose of an API. So we mentioned REST, correct? Let's talk about what REST really means. So REST, that means representational state transfer, simply means that every request that you make to the server and every response that you get from the server is stateless. It means that you're transferring the state of your request alongside with the request itself. And the response is basically the same thing. You're getting back the response with the state of the response. It is simple to understand if I give you an example. Let's say that you're making a request to a server where, for example, you don't have a session on it, right? You did not sign in to the server. So every request that you make to that API has to go alongside with your authentication. Every request. It can be an API key, it can be a JSON token, it can be your username and password, which obviously is not safe, but that's why we have the other types of authentication. But it can be. The thing is, if you're talking about a REST or a RESTful API, it means that on every request you have to send the entire packet of information, including the state of the information. And what you're getting back from the server is also stateless. The document or the resource that is coming back from the server is going to contain its own state. That's simply it. You guys can read more on the documentation of REST, the REST architecture if you want. I'm not going too much deep in this video because I want to talk about how to build an API and what is the purpose of the API. This is not a lecture, right? This is just a quick tutorial. So with that said, we just talked about APIs, what they are, what is the purpose, and we talked about the REST architecture, which combined creates our beloved RESTful APIs. So now that you know what those are, let's talk about the HTTP protocol, not talking about the protocol itself, but rather because the APIs, the web APIs, they use the HTTP protocol to communicate, right? This is the standard these days. Let's just talk about what are the HTTP verbs and their codes. The GET method requests a representation of the specified resource. Requests using GET should only retrieve data. The POST method submits an entity to the specified resource, often causing a change in state or side effects on the server. The PUT method replaces all current representations of the target resource with the request payload. And finally, the delete method deletes the specified resource. These are the four most common methods that you can use on an API. And it is what you mostly are going to create for to have a proper API. But there are other methods that you should be aware of. One of them is head. The head method asks for a response identical to a GET request, but without a response body. What this means is that you can send a request to the server without actually asking for the resource. Let's see an example. I think it's easy to understand with an example. I want to check if the resource exists on the server or not before requesting for it. So what I can do is I can send a head request before, and the response that the server will give me will be mostly just the header, right? It's not going to be the file, it's not going to be any information or, well, any data about the file, but just the metadata about that file. Talking about endpoints, an endpoint on an API is just a URL pointing to a resource. So if you have an API, you're building an API with someone else, and they're talking about endpoints, they're just talking about the URL for that particular resource, okay? And the name endpoint is just formality. When we are building APIs, we don't build URLs. We're talking about endpoints, okay? So now let's talk about status codes. Status codes are what the API server will respond to the clients, okay? So there are 5 response status codes possible, 5 categories of status codes. So you have the informational responses, which range from 100 to 199. You have the successful responses, which range from 200 to 299. You have the redirection messages, which range from 300 to 399. You have your client error messages or responses. They range from 400 to 499. And you have your server error responses, which range from 500 to 599. So there you go. This is every piece of information that you need to create a good API. Obviously, there are much more information that you can use, many more other stuff that you could read about APIs in general to become a API master. But this is enough information for us to create our own API. So let's do that. Let's dive into it. All right, so we are here on our development environment, and I'm going to open Visual Studio Code. Okay, so let's open Visual Studio Code. And this is my tutorial Node API in Middleware folder. I created this especially for this video. All right, so let's start doing something with this. If you do not know how to use Node.js, first of all, I'll probably make a tutorial about it if you want. Let me know in the comments of this video if that's something useful for you. But obviously for this, I'm assuming you know how to use Node, NPM, Yarn, etc., and that you have everything installed. You can check if you have everything installed by typing node -- version on your console, and this is going to display the version of Node that you're using. Node comes with NPM, so if you do the same for NPM, this should show you the version of NPM that you have. Although we are not using NPM for this tutorial, we are going to use Yarn -- version, and you can see the version of Yarn. If you don't have Yarn installed, go check on Google for Yarn, how to install it. It's pretty simple. You install it using NPM anyway. So yeah, you should have these installed and know how to use. So let's dive into it. So let me clear the console and let's go for, I can just close this because I'm not going to use, but I'm going to start a new project, okay? Okay, so let's start by initializing the project. So I'm going to say yarn init, and this is going to create some information for me on the, and is going to create a package JSON file. Okay, so when you do this, it's going to ask you a series of questions, and in my case, I just enter. I accepted the default for everything because I think it's easier to change directly on the file, and this is exactly what I'm going to do. But as you can see here, after you answer all of your questions, this is going to save a new file called package.json, right? So this is the contents of the package.json file. I'm just going to type server here. This is the main file of our application. License MIT, which is the license that I always use. What I'm going to do here, we're going to change this. I'm not going to explain too much about the package.json file, what it is, what its purpose. But again, this should be part of the Node tutorial. Again, if you guys want, I can do it. Let me know in the comments. But I am going to type a few things here. And this I've just changed to version 0.0.1. I like to use semantic versioning. I can explain about semantic versioning, not on this video. But let's start typing some things in here. So this is my main file. I am going to create a few scripts, especially to start. I'm going to type node server.js and serve would be node mon server.js. This is going to be a private project and of type module. Again, don't worry about it. Just copy and paste the file, the information, just type it in, and that's it. All right. So with these scripts, now what I can do is I can see them here on my npm scripts, and then it's easy for me to start and debug this server using these two buttons that you can see here. And that's the whole purpose of using scripts, right? It's also because if you have a very long line of code here, let's say I have the test script, and the test script tends to be a very long script because you're going to define a series of parameters for the tests, and it tends to be a very long line of code. So you just type your very long line of code here, a long line for your console here, or terminal in the case of Linux, and every time you want to test, you don't need to type that long line again, right? All you do is you can just type yarn start or npm start or npm test in the case of test. You're going to define the name of the script here. And then this command is going to be run for you, okay? Also, if you have the npm scripts showing on your Visual Studio Code, which is native from Visual Studio Code, you just click here and you enable or disable this little window here. And now you have access to these buttons, right? So you can hit run here or the debug. We're going to use the debug quite a lot on this video, so bear with me. So my main point of entry for this project is server.js. So let's create this server.js file, right? And while we do things here, we're going to talk about what we're doing, why, and we're going to learn about creating an API using Node.js. Keep in mind that all of what I'm going to talk here is transferable for whatever language that you guys want to use. That means if you're using Python, if you're using C#, if you're using Java, the concepts that we're going to talk about here are the same, right? Just the syntax, the language, this is different, but the concepts should be followed. They should be the same, okay? All right, so assuming you guys know how Node works and how a Node application works, we need to install a few libraries so we can use it on our little application. So for this particular application, I am going to need Express. So doing yarn add Express. It is going to install all the dependencies that I need, which is just this one, and is going to create the node module folder for me, node modules folder, right? And since I have this nodemon serve script here, I am going to yarn add --dev nodemon. This is going to add a dev dependency into my project, and in this case is nodemon. We're going to use nodemon because every time I change something on the server, I want to change it, save the file, and not have to restart my server every time. And we are going to change a lot of stuff during the development, and I don't want to keep stopping and restarting the server manually. Nodemon is a tiny library that you can add to your dev dependencies, meaning that this is not going up into production once you deploy this into production. But this helps because it keeps watching all the files. When you start your application using nodemon, it watches the files that you have on your folders. And every change made to one of those files triggers a restart, an automatic restart of the server. This is exactly what we want because I don't want to keep restarting the server by hand. All right, so this is actually all we need for this tutorial. Now let's create our server. So first of all, what we need for an API is an HTTP server, right? Web APIs these days, like I said in the beginning of this video, they start and end with a server. The easiest way to create a server in Node.js is using Express. It's not the only way. You have the more modern version of Express, which is Koa. You could use Koa for creating your APIs, which I do recommend, since this is Koa is an evolution of Express, right? Koa was made by the same people that made Express, so it is a very stable and reliable server, HTTP server, and you should look into it. You should use Koa. In this case, we are going to use Express because Express is easier to understand, right? And it's easier to implement. So let's go into Express, but you could use Express, you could use Koa, you could use Facify, which is another thing entirely, but it's also an HTTP server. So let's start by using Express, okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put my reference up here on the other monitor, and we're going to start typing things. So first of all, I'm going to import Express from Express, right? So this is going to import into this variable everything that is inside Express, so we can use the library here outside. And I'm going to start a new application. So const app equals to Express, like this, right? It's a function. So I'm just calling the function, and the result of calling this function is going to be stored in my app constant. Okay. With that, that's all you need. I can simply start the server if I want. So app.listen, which is a method from Express, I can listen on given port. So let's listen on port 8080. Okay. I can define the host name, but I don't want to do that. But I can define a host name where to listen for. And what I can do here is actually give a function as a callback. So when I start the method listen, this is going to start a series of things behind the scenes that I don't want to know what it is. And when it ends, this is going to call this function here. This is the function when everything is ready. This is the function that it will be called. So let's just console log saying server is ready. Okay. And sure enough, if I start this, this is going to start listening on port 80. So let's open the browser. Let's open the browser and go to localhost 8080. Okay? So you can see that there is something serving on port 8080, but it says cannot get root. Okay, this is the root. This actually means that my server is working fine, but there's nothing. There's nothing on my server, right? I don't have any resources on my server just yet. I don't have any HTML files. I don't have any files whatsoever to serve, and I don't have any URLs, or in the case of an API, I don't have any endpoints. So let's start creating a few endpoints for this API. How do we do that using Node.js? So I'm going to stop this, and that's why we use NodeMon instead of just working with Node, because every time you make a change here, we have to restart the server. So before I make the changes, I'm going to start using NodeMon. So you can see that the same thing happens, but it says it's watching the files now. So any changes that I've made that I make on this file is going to trigger an automatic restart here. So let's continue and let's create a few endpoints for this API. So I'm going to say app.get for the root folder, which is the folder that we're trying to see something. I'm going to say request response. This is a function, and I'm going to simply say response.send hello world. Right? Typical stuff. This is our hello world. So I've made my changes, I saved, and it triggered a restart on my server, right? So this is exactly what I want. Let's see now, if I refresh this page, sure enough, you have hello world, because now you have on this URL or this endpoint, you have a handler function that is handling your requests, and it is simply saying on your response, send back the message hello world. Actually, this is all you have to do to have your API sending back resources to your client's request. For every endpoint that you create, let's create a new endpoint here called /version, for example. And you want to send back the actual version of the server, which we know is 001. I could send a text with 001, or I can actually send an object called version 001, like this. So it's a JSON object, right? I can do using send, but it is recommended in the case of Express to use the method JSON, because this is going to guarantee that what I'm getting back is actually a JSON. And I don't mean in terms of just the object. I mean, this method is going to set the header for me. The content type is going to be application JSON. So all this does is the same. This is the same as response header, and then you can set your header content type application /JSON, and then send. Right? This is doing the same as this. Okay, so let's keep the above version. So now I have two endpoints. I have the root endpoint, which if I refresh here, it still works. But now I have /version. And sure enough, this returns an object called with the contents version and 001. All right, So let's talk about what we're doing here. I'm saying app.get. Get is the verb, right? We talked about HTTP verbs. So Express implement all the verbs that you want. So you can have post if you want to create a post endpoint, right? You have app.put if you want to create a put endpoint. App.delete. And do you also have app.patch, which is another HTTP verb. Put and patch are very similar, but they have different purposes. We're going to talk about the small difference in a moment. And obviously you have your app.head. In the case of Express, you also have all. That particular endpoint, this is not a verb, this is not an HTTP verb, but this particular method allows you to, for example, to have an endpoint where you can use whatever the verb is, right? So let's create an endpoint called all. And for this particular endpoint, you can use any of the HTTP verbs that you want, including get, that this endpoint is going to handle all of them, right? So what I can do here for this particular endpoint is say, again, I'm going to create a function that is a handler, and I can say response.send. This handles all requests. All right, perfect. So I have three endpoints now. I have /all, /version, and just /, which is the root, right? This is perfect. Now we are starting to understand more or less how an API should work, because we are creating endpoints here, right? These are my endpoints. And in fact, what I can do here to avoid confusion, I can create all of them under the /API endpoint. So /API /version /API /all. And when I save, this endpoint no longer exists. But if I go to API version, there you go. And just API, there you go, just this one. What about API all? Yeah, obviously it accepts a GET request, because every time you ask for a resource, ask for a page using the browser, what this is doing is it's making a GET request. You can easily see that if you open your console and if you refresh the page, you're going to see that this request is a GET request. Okay? So there you go. What else can we do? Because this is basically, well, I'm making an API. This is perfect. What else can we do? Obviously, we want to test the other types of methods, but they all use the same configuration, more or less. Especially when you're using Express, you set your verb, right, using the app. You set your endpoint, and you set a function that will be used to handle your request. So all the functions that you send here, they should have a request and response, right? These are the objects that are going to help you define what your API does. So let's do something more useful with this, right? By the way, before we go any further, what happens if I type something that doesn't exist, right? Like this. Well, it's giving me an error. Let's check out the error. So it's a 404. Automatically, the Express framework, when it doesn't find anything that it is like the URL that you're looking for, the endpoint that you're looking for, it automatically responds with a 404. So we don't need to do anything here if you don't want, but you can do, you can handle your own 404 errors like this. So in this case, we are going to use the use method for every other endpoint, right? And we're going to create again a handler function with request and response. And we're going to send a response with the status code of 404 and a message saying 404 not found. Why would I do that? Well, in this case, let's say, for example, that I want to send further information, another type of information here, right? Because app use asterisk, this means that any other endpoint that I put is going to be handled by this. It can be a 404, but what I can say is, well, if the endpoint does not exist, just redirect the user to the root folder, for example. In this case, this is an API. I don't want to do that. But I don't want to get an error message either. I want to get something like this. What I could do in this case, and I still have a 404 because after all, I said that I want to set the status code for the response as 404, right? But let's say in this case that I want to send a nice, neat 404 page. It's not the case, again, because we're building an API, but let's say that I want to send some information about the resource, the request that was made, etc., etc. I could send a JSON with that message here. But in this case, since we are using the browser to debug our application or API, it is nice to see 404 not found here instead of cannot get. So let's keep it like that. But bear in mind, these two are methods, unique methods that Express gives us to handle all types of requests, any HTTP verb, into a specified endpoint, and for all the other endpoints, or any endpoint in this case. So bear in mind that this has to be the last one defined. If I define this before anything else, obviously what is going to happen is every time I do a /API, although I do have this here, this one is the one that is going to be assumed because I have this first. So if I go to API now, I still get a 404 because this was defined before the rest. So let's undo all of this and keep this here. All right, perfect. Now let's, like I said, let's do something more useful with this. Let's say I have an array of patients, right? And I'm going to define my array of patients here. So let's say I have 5 patients, right? So ID, name, and age. Let's say 22. And I'm going to copy and paste 5 of these and change the IDs and the names. 2, 3, 4, and 5. and maybe the ages. So this one is 18, 22, 38, 45, and 76. All right. So I have 5 patients, different names, different ages, and I want to create an API that gives me the ability to get some resources from this database. Let's say this is my database, all right? So let's start by creating, let me just do this. So app version, I want always, because I want this to be available always, right? But in this case, I can have, for example, patients, and this is going to return all the patients, right? I'm going to change the code here. I want an API patient by ID. So I'm going to pass an ID, and I want one patient instead of the list of patients. Let's see. I want patient by age, and then I want to pass a range of ages. Yeah, I want to pass a range of ages, okay? Because then we can use different methods here. I'm going to show you how this works. All right? And finally, I want to delete some patient. And this is not all, this is get, obviously. Because I'm getting, I just want to retrieve some resource from the server. So the method that we use is get, right? Let's make 2 other endpoints, which is API patient, wow. Again, request a response. Let me copy this. And we need a comma here. Okay, so this is an endpoint that I'm going to be using to post a new patient and delete, right? So now we have some endpoints, some interesting endpoints here to use, to implement, to change the one resource or several resources on my server, right? So let's implement the get responses. So patients, all I need to do is to respond with a JSON of patients, because I want the entire list, right? Patient by ID, on the other hand, is a little bit different. How can I pass the ID to my API? Well, there are 3 basic ways that you can use to pass an ID. One is using the body of the message. Although body can only be used if you're using the post method, the delete method, and the put or patch methods. You cannot use body when you're using get. Well, you can. It is just going to be ignored. All right? So you don't use body when you're using get. So the 2 remaining ways that you can use to pass an ID, to pass any parameter into the API, is by using parameters. So you have the information that you want to pass on your URL, right? This is one method. So let's use this method to get the idea of the patient that I want to get, right? So my request, let's do it like this. So the ID is going to be on my request params, right? When I do something like this on the URL, express has a feature that when you do this, request parameters has ID. And sure enough, if you're using Visual Studio Code and you have IntelliSense turned on, when you mouse over the request parameters, you can see that I have an ID string there. That's because I have this on my URL. Let's see if that's true. So if I continue the URL and say this, you can see that I have two different parameters that I can use. That's because request parameters will contain everything that is on this, using this syntax on your URL. Okay? So in this case, we just want the ID. So let's do this. I'm using the structure here for the request parameters, and ID is going to be a string variable, or in this case, a constant, that is going to contain request parameters ID. And now what I can do is I can respond with a JSON of my patients dot find, and I want to find the patient where patient dot ID is the same as ID. Bear in mind, and I'm using the double equals here, not the triple equals, because the type is not the same. While I have ID here as a number, when it comes from parameters, it is always going to be a string. So in this case, what I could do is I could put all of these as strings instead of numbers. And then I could use the triple equals here, because they are going to be the same value and type. Or I can use the double equals and go with it. So let's just do this, because IDs these days are not numbers. They are unique IDs with letters and numbers. So let's say my ID is a string. So I can use the triple equals here. So this is going to find a patient based on the parameters, right? Let's see if that's true. Let's start testing our API. For now, I'm going to use the browser because we are dealing with GET methods. But at some point, I'm going to boot up Postman, and we are going to start using Postman to do that. For now, let's say that I want my API/version. Perfect, this is working. Now I want API patients, and this is going to list all the patients. It's going to send the entire JSON for me. That is perfect, that is working. But now let's say I want patient/2. Not found. Why is that? Because I did not put by ID. So let's put by ID here. Perfect. So there you have it. ID2, name patient2, age 22. It is perfect. If I put 4, it's going to return the same, well, a different patient. So this is working. Now, let's do something else. Let's do by age, because by age, and you can see that I don't have parameters here. And that's because we are going to use a different method for this endpoint. I told you that you have 3 ways to pass information, to pass parameters to your API. One is through the body, which we don't use when we're using GET. The second one is parameters. And the third one is using your query string. The query string is when you have an endpoint, and this is exactly what I want to do, by age, and you type something like this, question mark, min equals to 30, and max equals to 50, for example, and you can go on. And I don't know, name starts with equals to Pat, for example. And you can go on putting whatever you want on the query string, because this is part of the URL, right? You're just writing some strings here, some queries. And therefore, you have access to something. Let's call min and max here. You have access to something on the request that is your query, right? In this case, you have request query min and request query max. In this example here, you also have request.query.name starts with, but we don't want to use that. We just want the min and max, right? So with using the same structure syntax that I use here, we can get min and max from the request query, and you can respond with a JSON of all the patients. In this case, I don't want to find, I just want to filter every patient where patient.age is greater or equal than the min, and patient.age is less or equal than the max. Okay, so this is going to filter out all the patients that I have between the ages of min and max, and it's going to send back. So in this case, I have ages ranging from 18 to 76. If I do something like this, minimum age is 30. So these two are not going to be contained, and max age equals to 50. This one is not going to be contained. So let's see. I should have 38 and 45, right? I should have 2 patients. And indeed I do. So I have ID 3, which is this one with age 38, and ID 4, which is this one with age 45. If I lower the minimum to 20, I should have also patient 2. Very, very good. Very interesting. So I want to now create new patients. This is all good. This is all working. But now I want to create new patients, right? So how can I do that? Well, this is also very simple. Since I'm using post, I should have access to request dot body. Okay. So first of all, let's just console log request.body. Okay, and response end. This is just to prevent the I have to, every time you make a request to a server, it has to respond with something. Otherwise, it's going to block your request. Your request will be forever running, because the server never sent back a response. So your request is kept as pending. So to avoid that, let's just response end. This is going to get back a 200 response to the client. But in this case, it's a post request. I cannot use, if I try to do this, API patient, using the browser. Well, you guys know that when we use the browser, what we are doing is a GET request. So this endpoint does not indeed exist for the GET request. You cannot find it here on the GET request. GET API patient does not exist. What you have is API patients or API patient by ID and some ID. This endpoint in particular does not exist for the method GET, although it does for the method POST. So we are done with the browser. We cannot use the browser anymore. Let's boot up Postman. Again, I will assume that you guys know how to use Postman, right? This is a simple application that does only requests, right? You can use it to test your own APIs. I don't want to see any collections. Actually, I don't want to see anything. I just want to start a new request. Well, you can set the method that you want to use here, the HTTP verb that you want to use. In this case, I will just put HTTP localhost port 8080 API and patience. Again, if I can write patience, just to see if this works. And indeed, it does. So, and it looks much better than it does in the browser. And you can see that the response was in the JSON. If I start a new call here, you see that every time I get the responses, I don't know what it is, but they could be raw, text, auto, etc. But I know this is a JSON response because the header of my response says that it is. So if I go to the console and check out the request that I made, here's the request, here's the response. So like I said, content type application JSON char set UTF-8 were set when I did this, right? So response JSON sets the header, the content type of the header correctly, so it can be presented correctly for you on your client side. If you have an application, in this case we are using Postman, that using an application check the response, then you will see the response in a neat way because you have everything set correctly. This is just a detail. I digress. So I can see that my API is working. So let's make a new request, but this time is going to be post request. It's not going to be to API patients. It's going to be to API patient, just the singular. And I do have a post endpoint with that URL. I want to post a new patient. So what I want to do is obviously go to the body. I'm going to say this is a JSON body. And I want to say, well, I have to use the same format that I'm using here, right? So I'm going to say I have an ID for my patient. It will be ID 6. The name of my patient is going to be patient 6. Yeah, it's complaining because it has to be like this because it's JSON. And the age of my patient is going to be 81. Okay, so this is my patient, my new patient that I want to post to my patients. So let's see when this gets here, how does it get? Let's see. Well, I haven't defined. Why do I haven't defined? And when you start working, and I got a 200 response, right? Everything went okay with my request. But it did not, to be honest, because I am passing a body, I'm doing everything correctly, but the body is not getting to my server, right? When it gets to this line, request body is undefined. I don't have a body on my request. Why is that? This is something to do with Express, okay? This has nothing to do with APIs in general. This is a particular case when you're creating an API using Express, right? Express is very unopinionated, and you need to define everything that you want to use before you use it. Request body is something that is not native, and you have to tell Express that you want to use a request body. How you do that? Well, you have to define on your application, you have to say use express dot JSON. You want to use the JSON handler for this application. The JSON handler is exactly what is going to give you the ability to use JSON body requests, right? And as you can see, you have a few options here that you want that you should use if you want. One of the most important ones is the limit, where you define the limit of your requests. For example, you don't want bodies with more than 1 megabyte of size, right? But I'm not going to define any of this. I am just going to say, just do this. So now if I save and let the server restart and try again, now I have a body. Okay? So remember, if you're using Express and you're going to be sending requests using request body, you're going to be sending requests using JSON body, you need to tell Express that you're going to do that, right? So it's just one line of code, but you need to remember to do that. Perfect. Okay, so now I do have request body. So let's get rid of this. And let's use the body. So let's say I don't, well, const body, well, I can say patient equals to request.body, right? Like this, because it's not body dot patient, it's the body itself. So I have a new patient. All I have to do is patient, plural, because it's my database, it's my array, dot push the new patient. And then I can respond with a just end, because I don't need to send anything back. And if this is correct, let's see. If I go to get my patients, I can see 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. If I do this now, it should include this new patient into the array. And if I do this now, it should get back 6. And indeed, it does. Well, this is neat. It means that the post request is also working fine and doing whatever it needs to do. Let's then implement the delete method. The delete method, there are, like I said, there are several ways you can use the API to pass information to it. So I could do patient delete API patient and the ID like this, or like this, right? Or in this case, just pass the ID on the body. So delete API patient, I am going to const ID. I'm going to get the ID from request.body. So request.body.id should have the ID of the patient that I want to delete. Okay. I can delete the patient. Let's, instead of const, let's use a let here, because I will change this. Let's do it like this. So now my patients array is going to be equals to patients.filter all the patients where patient.id is not equal to the ID that I passed. This and then end. because what this is going to do is this is going to filter my array and is going to exclude any patient ID. Well, it's going to keep any patient ID that is different from the ID that I passed. So essentially, it's going to keep every other patient except the one that has the ID that I passed. So let's see if that's true. If now, let's again get all the patients. I have 5, right? Let's post a new patient. Now I should have 6. But now let's create a new request. This is going to be a delete request to the same URL, okay? API patient, and you notice that I have API patient on 2 separate endpoints or verbs in this case. They can be the same if your verbs are different, right? So for the delete method, I want to pass a body, and again, it's going to be a JSON body with the ID of the patient that I want to delete. So the ID, the patient that I want to delete, let's say it's 4, okay? If I do this, not found, API patients is not patients, it's patient, that's why. So let's do it again. 200. Okay. So if I go here now, it should have eliminated patient number 4. And indeed it did. So I have 1, 2, 3, 5, 6. Perfect. So we have our API working. This is amazing. So with little code, you could create your own API. This obeys all the laws, all the constraints of a RESTful API, and it is pretty simple to implement. As you can see here, 50 lines of code. You have a very good API doing all the crude operations, right? You can get, you can post new patients, you can delete patients. You can also have an endpoint with put to modify existing records, right? But it follows the same syntax. I'm not going to do this here. It's a waste of time. The last thing that I want to talk about, however, before we end up this tutorial, is about middleware. What is a middleware? Well, middlewares are handlers because all the requests that you do, all the endpoints, right, they have their own handler functions. Middlewares are handlers that, as the name suggests, are going to be in between your request and the endpoint handler, right? So let's create a few middlewares here before you guys go crazy, because it's easier to explain showing than just talking. So, like I said, middlewares are just handlers, right? They're going to run before this, right? Before this handler runs. So let's create a few middlewares here. So this is going to be a new module. So I'm going to export my functions. Since this has to be a handler function, obviously this must have a request and a response, but this is a middleware. So it needs a third option, a third parameter, which is next. I'm going to explain what it is in a moment. Let's name this function validate request. Okay, let's create another function, which is going to be log request. And maybe a third function to count requests. Okay? And since we are going to have a count, I'm going to create two variables here. One is the limit, which I'm going to set to 10, and the actual count, which is going to be 0 for now. All right? So let's try to understand how this works, okay? So what I said was, for each endpoint implemented, I have a handler function, a function that will handle your request, correct? Middleware is just a handler function that is going to run in between your request and your endpoint handler. Is going to be in the middle, hence the name. So let's say that I want to, let's start with the log, which is a little bit easier to implement, right? Let's say you cannot see, every time I make a request to this API, for example, I'm making a request right now, you cannot see anything on the console, right? You get a response, but you don't know what's happening on the server. Let's say you want to log every request that I make. Well, this is easy if I just console log, let's say, the request dot body. I can say body, and also the URL, for example. Okay. Let's say that I want to log everything. I think it's URL. I can't remember, but we can use the breakpoint here. And since we are going to debug, I'm going to start this in debug mode. All right. So you're now actually debugging. So let's use this, right? I'm going to import everything. So import log request from middleware.js. But I'm also going to import all the rest because we're going to use. So let's import everything. So let's say I don't want to do anything with the version endpoint, but I do want to log every time I request a patient. So let's do that. Let's just put an array here in the middle and say for this endpoint, I want to log request, right? So every time I call this endpoint now, what is going to happen is before this runs, before this particular endpoint handler runs, this is going to run first. And as you can see, I have request, response, and next, right? The next is exactly to say, to express, please run the next in line, the next middleware in line, or if this is the last one, it's going to run the next handler in line. So in this case, when I go for this endpoint here, this is going to run first this one, and the next one in line is this endpoint handler here. So let's see if this works. Let's save everything, and let's make a request. So the first breakpoint that hits is this one here, right? So I have request, I have my request URL, and I have my request body, which has nothing, right? But this is going to get logged, and I can remove the breakpoint here because you guys, I hope you guys now have an idea on how this works. This is going to log my request, okay? And then is going to jump to the next handler, which in this case is just the endpoint handler. And this is going to respond like always does. If I do a second request, all it happens here is you can see it is responding as usual, but every time I make a request, this is now logging into the console every time I do a request. This is very useful if you want to log requests on your server because you want to debug anything or you want to actually know what is happening on your server. But this is also useful if you want to control access to your server. So there are several ways to control access to your server. One of them is through validation, right? So let's say I want to validate this request. So I can say if request.headers.api key is equals to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, then I can continue, right? So return next. Else, I can just return a response with the status code of 403, which we already saw, dot send. You don't have access to this resource, right? So this is one way you can use to control access to some resources on your application, on your API. You can check for API keys, for example. You can check for session IDs. You can check for JSON web tokens. You can check for whatever you want, right? You are going to implement your own constraints and you're going to create that using a middleware. Now, what I can do is I can use this same middleware, and for every request, I'm going to check the header and see that if I have an API key for that request. Let's implement this here. This is an array. So first I want to log, then I want to validate the request. Okay, so it's as simple as that. I want to do this for getting patients, but I also want to do that for getting patient by ID, which is essentially the same thing. By age, which is essentially the same thing. I want to do that for the post requests. I want to do that definitely for the delete requests, but not for the rest, right? This one, for example, I don't want to do anything with it. I don't need to validate. If I'm asking for the API version, well, that's fine. I don't need to validate, but these get and set new resources on my server. I want to validate those requests. So with that done, now if I try to send a request to this endpoint, what I get is a 403 forbidden with the message you don't have access to this resource. It is still getting logged because the log request comes before the validate request, but I don't have access to that endpoint anymore. So let's go for an authorization. And let's say that I have an API key with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. If now I do this request, I get back my access to the endpoint because this is validating. I can put a breakpoint here and we can check how this is working. But obviously, this gets called. I check the header. I can see that I have a key called API key, right, with the value that I'm expecting. And then if all of that is true, obviously, I'm going to return next. And the next in line is, in this case, my endpoint handler. And I got back access to my API. In this case, if I try to insert a new patient, well, I don't have access to this resource, because I am not passing any authorization, right? So the validation works. This is perfect. What about counting? Well, counting, let's think about counting as a rate limit. You have a limit to call the API, right? So let's say that my limit is 10, right? What I can do in this case is I can just do count plus plus, right? And say if count is greater or equal to my limit, then I want to return a response with the status of 429. We also saw this. This is the rate limit reached response code, and this the message that I want to send is you reached your limit on this API. Okay, or else I just go for next, and I can return next or just next, doesn't matter. I use return because it every time I use return, I don't need to use an else here, because this is the last line is going to if this is true, this is the last line that is going to be run. Okay. So count request. Now that I have this, I can simply say that I want this to be before or after the validation. Before. Count request. Right? I want this to be before the validation, because if I reach my limit, I don't need to do anything else. So there you go. I'm going to do this for every endpoint. All right, so we have implemented successfully some middlewares here to avoid having our API hammered by the developers, by the users. And we have a very secure API. So let's test everything. So now, if I go here and I do have this, I can send once, twice, 3 times, and let's count. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Woo! You reach your limit on this API. And from now on, I cannot do anything else, because I essentially reached my limit of calls to this API, right? So this rate limiting, although I have everything correct, I have my API key, I have everything correct, I just don't have any more tokens to use on this API, right? I reached my limit. So there you go. These are some examples of middleware that you can use on your API to prevent users to prevent abuse of from your users, from your developers on your API. You can rate limit them. You can validate the request based on API keys or JSON Web Tokens or whatever you want. And you can implement all of that using middlewares, right? And you put all your middlewares here before your endpoint handler, and there you go, in the order that you want. So I want first to log the request, and now you can see that I have a small mistake here on my my logging function. Imagine that if I have several endpoints using this log request and middleware, if I had to change all of those because I found an error, well, using middlewares, now I just have to fix this one. What I want here is JSON stringify request body. And now with that, if I make a request, this gets properly logged. And with the post request, I can see the actual body that I'm sending. So there you go. This is fixed. And I don't have access to this resource. Although everything's correct, right? I got a 403 because obviously I don't have authorization, but let's authorize. And there you go. I have a 200. And if I send again here, perfect, here's my new patient. And if I keep doing calls to the API, let's authorize this one as well. I want to delete and 200. And I want to see if that was deleted. It was deleted, perfect. And if I keep doing this, at some point, I'm going to reach my limit. All right, and then I cannot do anything else. And I get it to 429 too many requests, right? On all of them. I hope you guys enjoyed the tutorial. I hope you guys enjoyed the presentation. I'm trying to make a new kind of video where I have more things written on the screen to maybe make it a little bit more interesting for you guys. Again, if you like this video, please thumbs up. Click on the bell to receive notifications for the next videos. And if you guys want a little bit more advanced stuff, advanced tutorials, please let me know in the comments. Please let me know in the comments if you want those parts that I did not explain too much, because this video was in particular for APIs and middlewares only. But if you want any other tutorials, please let me know in the comments what you want explained, what type of tutorials should I do next. These videos are a lot of work, so I do appreciate if you guys thumbs up on the video, and yeah, please share with your friends, with your family. That's it for this video. I hope you guys liked it, and yeah, I see you on the next one. Goodbye for now.